totes i a tots. Com ha dit el Jordi, el meu nom és Cristian Herbolzheimer. Soc el director del programa de transicions de pau d'una ONG internacional amb seu a Londres que es diu Conciliation Resources i treballo més específicament als casos de Colòmbia, Filipines i una mica de retruc, País Basc i d'altres contextes. Fa 8 anys que treballo a Conciliation Resources i probablement la persona responsable de que jo estigui en aquesta feina està asseguda al meu costat. Celia McKeon em va contractar juntament amb l'Andy Carl per treballar a Conciliation Resources en un moment on jo havia acabat el meu màster de construcció de pau i havia fet una estada de pràctiques a Filipines i necessitaven algú que tingués coneixement directe sobre Filipines i Colòmbia. I clar, en el món no n'hi havia gaires. Haguéssim pogut dir també que parli català i sigui mig suec. I llavors també m'haguessin trobat a mi. Però per això li estic molt agraïda. I abans que es donés aquesta situació, aquesta contractació, jo ja havia tingut, com molts altres, molt de respecte i apreciació per la feina que feia Conciliation Resources de documentar processos de pau a través de la seva revista Acord, que ja té més de 20 anys, intentar contribuir informació i punts d'anàlisi perquè entenguem com s'acaben els conflictes armats, que és una resposta a la qual intuïtivament des del moviment de la pau hi tenim una resposta molt ràpida, però a l'hora de fer-ho pràctic doncs no és que no la tinguem nosaltres, no la té ningú, no la tenen els governs, no la tenen les forces armades, no les tenen els grups guerrillers, no les té ningú perquè cada context és diferent i encara estem treballant per trobar solucions als conflictes violents, als conflictes armats, que no només acabin amb la violència directa, sinó que permetin transformacions socials profundes i estables. I això, fins a la data, encara no s'ha produït enlloc. No hi ha, malauradament, cap procés de pau que hagi funcionat com haguéssim volgut que funcionés i potser un dels casos més concrets i que la Celia coneix millor és el cas d'Irlanda del Nord, que l'any que ve celebrarem 20 anys dels acords del Divendres Sant, que van posar fi a un dels conflictes més significatius en el món, que ha estat lloat i ha estat un referent de construcció de pau per molts nosaltres i per molts altres països en el món, però que 20 anys després encara no està resolt. Les comunitats viuen segregades, van a escoles segregades i la interacció i la reconciliació i la construcció d'un espai d'identitat comuna encara segueix sent complicat. I l'acord recent entre el Partit Unionista i de recolzar el govern de la Theresa May al Regne Unit doncs n'és un bon exemple. La Celia treballa més enllà de l'obvi. La Celia busca entendre més enllà de la superfície quines són les dinàmiques que mantenen els conflictes i entendre-les en profunditat per mirar de trobar-hi una solució. I una solució que no ve imposada intel·lectualment o políticament des de fora, sinó a través dels seus propis protagonistes. Poc després que jo entrés a treballar amb Conciliation Resources, ella va agafar una altra feina a la Roundtree Foundation i ha estat fent una feina d'aquestes poc visibles, de formigueta, de treballar precisament i sobretot en el cas d'Irlanda del Nord i aprofundir, quan tothom hi ha donat el conflicte armat per acabat i el procés de pau per exitós, doncs seguir encara treballant amb perseverància, amb intel·ligència, amb els protagonistes de la societat d'Irlanda del Nord per mirar d'aprofundir i arribar realment a les arrels del problema i donar-hi aquestes solucions estables i duraderes que tots volem en els processos de pau. Després d'haver-hi treballat molts anys, de forma més recent, ella ha estat una de les impulsores d'una iniciativa que ara us explicarà d'alternatives de defensa. És a dir, crec que és reflex d'aquesta voluntat i aquest compromís, jo diria que radical, de buscar solucions al tema de les violències en totes les seves dimensions, que després d'haver treballat en aquest context concret d'Irlanda del Nord, ara s'ha embarcat amb d'altres persones i d'altres organitzacions en una tasca molt pròpia i molt candent de fa diverses dècades, però que ara torna a ser rellevant al Regne Unit, com a casa nostra, sobre alternatives de defensa. I aquesta és la presentació que des de FundiPau li hem demanat que faci avui, que comparteixi per què ara al Regne Unit es plantegen aquests debats i de quina manera els estan plantejant. I després, com ella mateixa m'ha dit abans que comencéssim, ella també vol sentir i aquí nosaltres per què ens ho estem plantejant també. I per tant, després de la seva presentació, que puguem tenir una conversa i un intercanvi d'inquietuds i d'idees sobre el que estan pensant i fent allà sobre aquesta temàtica i el que estan fent i pensant sobre la mateixa temàtica aquí a Catalunya. I sense més, doncs, gràcies, Celia, per estar avui amb nosaltres.
Buen día, buenos días. Good morning, everybody. It's an enormous pleasure to be here. I'm very grateful to Christian for the introduction and also for the friendship and companionship that we've shared over the years that we've worked together, been in touch with each other. I'm grateful to all of you also for being here today, for your interest in this topic, and also for allowing me to speak to you in English and with the help of translation. First thing I want to do is acknowledge the significance of this topic for the lives of millions of people outside of this room. There is horrific violence going on a scale that we can scarcely comprehend a lot of the time. And in the UK in the last 3 months, that's come a little bit closer to home. We've had 4 atrocities against civilians in the last 3 months. And I think the casual and horrific brutality of those atrocities has really made questions of security much more urgent. I know personally that it's been hard to listen to the testimonies of survivors and of their families and to realize that their grief and their pain is something I can't fully comprehend. And at the same time, to put my son to bed in the evening and try and answer the question why, which is what he keeps asking me. And yet I'm also really aware that the scale of violence and suffering that we've seen recently in the UK pales completely in comparison with the numbers in other parts of the world. So in Iraq, 1,000 civilians were killed in the first 3 weeks of last month. In Yemen, I think there's an average of 13 civilians being killed every single day. And in the Democratic Republic of Congo, to take another example, there are 2.7 million internally displaced people. In South Sudan, there's a famine caused by war. So my first response to the question of whether another security and foreign policy is possible is that it has to be. We can't continue to witness the tragedies that are unfolding around the world and come to the conclusion that we as human beings should not be trying to do things differently. We collectively need to make some pretty urgent changes, pretty big changes, and pretty fast. My second response to the question of whether another security policy is possible is that it is. Policies are a matter of choice, and a different approach to foreign and security policy is possible, just as it's possible to change any area of public policy. There is nothing inevitable about current approaches, And if we look around the world, we can already see that there is a variety of responses to conflict and violence in different parts. But my third response to the question of whether a different policy is possible is to acknowledge the complexity and difficulty of bringing about change. What kinds of changes to foreign and security policy would actually better meet the needs of the world as we find it? This is a really difficult question, and I don't think anybody truly has the full answer. And if that question isn't hard enough, we need to then move on to another question. What is required to create the conditions for these changes to become a reality? So I think these are the real questions we're going to be focusing on today. What kinds of changes to foreign and security policy are needed to better meet the demands of the world that we find, and how can we make these a reality? And I think they're questions that require the collective wisdom of all of us in this room. They're questions that some of us are grappling with in the UK context. And what I want to try and do today is share some of our thinking with you and hope that it connects to experiences and thinking here. And hope also that we can really learn from your insights here in Catalonia. So to address the question of whether another approach to foreign and security policy is possible, I wanted to try and do 4 things in this lecture. I think I need to start first with a brief analysis of current global security trends and talk about some of the factors that are driving insecurity. Then I want to share some of our thinking about the dominant responses to current global insecurity and how these are falling short. And I'll use the UK's approach as an example of that. And thirdly, I want to go on and make some suggestions about what a different approach to security could look like and how it might work in practice. And finally, if you're still all awake, I will share some thinking about what some of the obstacles to change might be and what might be necessary in order to make a different approach to security a reality. And one last caveat before I dive in. This thinking arises from our experiences as practitioners, as people who've been involved in responding to conflict and violence for some years. But we're practitioners mainly living in the north, and our experiences are necessarily limited by our own lives and perspectives. And so they definitely need filling out and complementing with the perspectives and ideas of people from other parts of the world, and especially by those who've been on the receiving end of foreign and security policies of some of our countries. Okay. I translated my slides into Spanish, so you can tell me afterwards how many accents I missed. I hope you can see it okay. So let's think first about some of the causes of global insecurity. So we've identified kind of 4 key drivers. So economic inequality. Despite all the wealth that's been created in the past decades, around 4 billion people in the world are still living in poverty. And the richest 1% of the population now have more wealth than the rest of the world combined. A second significant driver is social and political marginalization, so the concentration of power among a small elite who largely tend to be white, male, and economically privileged. Worldwide, 69 of the top 100 economic entities are corporations and not countries. And the winners of the current neoliberal model are dictating the rules of the game. The third factor driving conflict would be climate change, and particularly scarcity of resources and the competition that's arising in relation to those, and the environmental degradation that is arising from the lifestyles that we are currently living. There's an ecological crisis, which is causing coastal flooding, climate-driven migration, and rising food prices. And these phenomena are only going to increase. And the fourth cause of conflict would be militarization, so the response of states and non-state actors and the resort to violence to assert control, project power, or resolve conflicts. The world's now spending 1,000 billion euros a year on the military in the name of defense. But what drives these drivers? I think there's a number of additional factors that we need to be aware of. Racism, patriarchy, nationalism, and human supremacy, essentially belief systems that hold that one group of people or one species is superior to others, and which justify systems of oppression, exclusion, or domination. Now, we all experience these drivers of insecurity differently, depending on our sex, our age, our place of birth, where we live. But what we see is as the world becomes increasingly interconnected, our security and our insecurity are increasingly interwoven with the fates of communities and societies in other parts of the planet. So how we choose to think about what security is, what it means, and how we choose to believe it can be created has a profound bearing on the kind of society we live in, the kind of relationships we have with others in the world, and the kind of future we'll create for generations to come. Okay, so what are some of the dominant responses to these trends? I'm going to talk about the UK because that's the place I know best, and the place where I'm trying to work for change. So in the UK, the dominant mainstream narrative, the conversation about security, frames the problem as follows: that the UK is a benign nation state, that it faces a complex of shifting threats from different parts of the world, and that needs to protect itself using coercive power abroad, and where necessary, authoritarian approaches at home. And this is a narrative that enjoys general consensus across the defence establishment, and it's codified in our government's National Security Strategy document. And this document essentially describes a technocratic approach to security, primarily concerned with deterring and defeating threats, which it neutralises through a range of capabilities that are deployed. And these capabilities are mostly hard power measures, and particularly offensive military capabilities. And so even though we have an austerity economic policy, the defence budget last year was £38 billion in the UK, spent on a combination of traditional military muscle, new technology, and a range of counter-terrorism activities. So I should be honest that my own personal values conflict with this approach, but I think it's ethically wrong, but I also think it's failing in practice. We're spending more and more money on the military, and yet people are feeling increasingly insecure. But I'm not the only person that's making these claims. So leading military analysts in the UK have also pointed to the UK's wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya as strategic failures. So not slight mistakes, but huge planned operations that failed to achieve their intended objectives and left each country racked by instability. According to the UK's intelligence services, the war in Iraq served to radicalise a large number of young Muslims in the UK, creating more of the very threat that it was supposed to be protecting us from. And also research in the United Kingdom is showing that a range of counter-terrorism measures that are being employed domestically are actually alienating Muslim communities and creating a kind of suspect community that is deeply counterproductive. Now, I don't want to in any way belittle or underestimate the huge challenges that are facing government and the state in committing to keeping us all safe and secure. But I would argue that it's precisely the severity and complexity of these challenges that requires us to think critically about concepts and practices of security, and particularly of national security. What often happens in the UK is that the term national security is used to close down debate and discussion. But what we need to be doing is opening it up and exploring assumptions and questions and beliefs, working out what works and what doesn't, and upgrading our thinking to reflect the complicated realities of the 21st century. So So I wanted to give you an example of how big this challenge is. So when I first started preparing talks on this theme, I did a search of images online for the term security. And this is what I came up with. So if you go on the Flickr, the photo sharing website, and type in security, these are the images that come up. And I don't know about you, but it doesn't make me feel particularly safe. But then I decided to do a search on the term peace. Personally, I find this almost as depressing. Yeah. Where are the people? Where is the agency? Where is the understanding of the complexity of building peace? It seems we're stuck in a world of feel-good symbols, of doves and rainbows, and we're not getting to grips with the issues. But I think the question that it also raises for me is what accounts for the difference between this and this? Why do we have such different understandings of security and peace? And I would like to suggest that that's in large part to do with the dominant framing of the concept of security by the political and military establishment. So these are some of the features of the narrative. There it is. These are some features of the narrative. So firstly, it privileges UK security as a supreme imperative to which the needs of people in other countries can be subordinated. It aims to advance national interests which are determined by the political elite, and it's not connected to the security needs of people in their communities. Thirdly, it assumes a short-term outlook and focuses primarily on immediate physical threats, largely overlooking the long-term drivers of insecurity I referred to before. It responds by trying to dominate and control, primarily through offensive military capabilities, a superpower alliance with the United States, and restrictions on civil liberties. And finally, it doesn't define security anywhere. In fact, it deliberately chooses not to define it, but focuses instead on actions and capabilities which are required to maintain what we call business as usual. So I wanted to give you an example of how that works in practice. And I wanted to take the case of the UK's relationship with Saudi Arabia. So despite the Saudi Arabia's atrocious human rights record, it's been a long-standing ally of the United Kingdom and a major recipient of our arms exports. And as you will also know, that the Kingdom is currently leading a military coalition to fight the Houthi uprising in Yemen, with support from the UK in the form of military assistance and arms exports. For the last 2 years, there have also been repeated allegations of the deliberate targeting of civilians, of war crimes, and the destruction of civilian infrastructure. And at the beginning of October last year, a Saudi warplane bombed a funeral in Sana'a, where over 140 people were killed and more than 500 people were injured. And for comparison, that's more people killed and injured in a single event than all of those combined in this year's attacks in the UK. A couple of weeks after that bombing, a motion was put in the UK Parliament calling on the UK government to withdraw its support for arms exports to Saudi Arabia pending an independent investigation. So it wasn't calling to cancel them entirely, just to suspend them while the atrocities were investigated. And the motion noted the UK's obligations under the Arms Trade Treaty, as well as its own national and European arms control legislation, noting that you should not be supplying weapons when there is a clear risk they may be used to commit violations of international humanitarian law. And when this motion was put before Parliament, it was defeated, with 283 MPs voting to continue the status quo, whereby arms exports and military advice continues to be provided to the Saudi military. So when I first saw the headlines about this vote, I was pretty shocked. I find it quite hard to understand how so many parliamentarians could continue to vote in favour of these policies. And so I looked at the record of the debate and tried to understand the justifications better. And essentially, the MPs that supported the continuation of the status quo used 3 arguments. Firstly, that the UK is a benign influence, so it has a positive influence on the Saudi government, and its involvement will help to bring about a peaceful solution to the conflict. Secondly, that UK arms exports secure jobs for British workers. And thirdly, that Saudi Arabia is an important ally in the fight against international terrorism. Now, if I had more time, I would point out the serious flaws with each of those arguments. But I think the main point I want to make is that they illustrate the assumptions that are underpinning our security policy more generally. These assumptions are essentially what I was referring to earlier. Our policies privilege the lives and jobs of people in the UK over the lives and security of people in other parts of the world. It's disconnected completely from the needs of people in Yemen. It takes a short-term approach, and it relies on military domination, and it tackles the symptoms of the problem, but not the actual causes. So examples like this underpin my conviction that in order to bring about change in foreign and security policy, we need to understand and engage with this meta-level narrative, the assumptions and interests about what security means, who it is for, and how it can be built. We need to expose and challenge these narratives, and we also need to develop compelling counter-narratives about how it could be different. So for the last couple of years, I've been part of a network of organizations, academics, and activists called Rethinking Security, who've come together around a shared concern that the dominant responses to global insecurity are making matters worse. Our experience as people who've been trying to find peaceful settlements of violent conflict or promote disarmament initiatives is that our efforts to build collective security are frequently being undermined by the dominant Western approach and the assumptions that underpin it. So I wanted to share with you some of our suggestions about how things could be done differently, which we published in this discussion paper, Rethinking Security, which is available online if you're interested. And I want to repeat that these ideas and suggestions don't offer a complete answer to the questions that we're trying to grapple with. They're a contribution to a debate which we think needs to broaden and deepen with as many perspectives as possible. So we start with an attempt to define the goal of security as grounded in the well-being of all people and life on our common planet, rather than being about the interests of the nation-state as defined by its elite. And in articulating that goal, we believe a few things about security: that it depends on healthy relationships, from the interpersonal to the international; that it requires a collective commitment to building the conditions of security over the long term, rather than relying on short-term coercive measures. Thirdly, that the potential role of the state or government is no more and no less important than other contributions at all levels of society, from citizens in their communities to regional and global institutions. And finally, that the common good requires security to be determined democratically by the many rather than the few. And we'd like to offer 4 guiding principles for a new narrative about security. So first of all, that it's a freedom. The UN originally described it as freedom from fear, freedom from want, and freedom to live in dignity. It implies communities where people can meet their fundamental needs. Secondly, it's a common right. It cannot, and usually shouldn't, be gained for one group of people at others' expense. It rests on solidarity rather than dominance. Thirdly, that it's a long-term practice underpinned by healthy, just relationships. It grows or withers according to how just and inclusive society is. And fourthly, it's a shared responsibility. Its challenges belong to all of us, not only to a small group of decision makers. So how could these principles be turned into a strategy? We'd like to suggest that it would need to have at least 4 dimensions. First of all, you'd need to invest in building the positive conditions of security, both for people in the UK and globally. And the original concept of human security, which you may have come across, and which has been instrumentalized in a lot of contexts, provides a useful starting point. So it outlines 7 basic dimensions of security: economic, food, health, ecological security, physical security, community security, and political security. So in essence, security requires the meeting of basic human needs. Secondly, the strategy would give priority to addressing the systemic drivers of insecurity that I referred to earlier: inequality, marginalization, climate change, and militarization. Thirdly, it would need to invest in building equitable relationships based on justice and inclusion. And it would require a recommitment to democratic participation and also principled multilateralism. Fourthly, it would require a more nuanced approach to crisis response, one which prioritizes the needs and interests of vulnerable communities and which puts peace, development, and human rights at its heart. So these would be the elements of a fresh approach, and arguably putting them in a box called foreign and security policy fails to communicate the nature of the shift that would be required. It would require a significant rebalancing of resources and capacities away from militarized responses and towards ecologically responsible development, promotion of human rights, diplomacy, and cooperation. And it would also require a commitment to tackling some of the structural drivers of current insecurity, and particularly the neoliberal economic model. So in this sense, we would understand security as a condition that arises from and grows out of policies that promote inclusion, justice, equality, and good governance. Now, some might say that this is a kind of unrealistic, utopian vision that takes insufficient account of the realities of the world that we find ourselves in. And I do understand that concern. We definitely live in a world that is shaped by the worst of human nature as well as by the best. But I would repeat my conviction that the current approaches are failing, and that if we're going to stand any chance of reversing current trends of violence and insecurity, we need to do things differently. I would also suggest that there is real-world evidence that supports the proposed changes we're suggesting. And it comes from communities and societies that have been scarred by often horrendous violence and chronic insecurity, and which have managed to embark on successful transitions towards peace and greater security. What we know from studies of these processes over the last 20 years is that peace is almost never a result of a successful security policy applied on its own. The most successful peace and transition processes are those which do a number of things, which address underlying causes of conflict and insecurity, which acknowledge and put in place efforts to meet basic human needs, which facilitate broad and meaningful public participation in the process, and women's participation is particularly significant here. And fourthly, that they demilitarize communities and societies, rebuilding trust in governance and the rule of law as the primary means of managing conflicts. Now, I'm not saying any of these peace processes are perfect. I've spent the last 7 years working very constantly in Northern Ireland, and I've seen up close the shortcomings of that peace process and all the serious issues that still need to be resolved. But I am convinced that the Northern Ireland Peace Agreement and the process that followed would not have been successful had it not tackled the underlying drivers of the conflict, not come up with a governance model that enabled greater equality, and not worked to demilitarize the communities that had become antagonized. What I'm also not saying is that there's a simple model from specific conflict situations that can be applied to global insecurity as a whole. But I do think it is possible to argue that these incredibly challenging processes, whether it's Northern Ireland or the Philippines or Colombia, I think they have a lot to teach us about what does and does not create the conditions for peace and security. And in the case of my own society, I wish the government would pay closer attention to the experiences garnered in Northern Ireland when it thinks about how to address insecurity in the rest of the world. So this brings me to the final question that I wanted to talk about. If we can imagine, even just for a minute, that a different approach to security is worth considering, how would we get there from here? What would it take to make those ideas a reality? So these are the practical questions that our network is currently grappling with in the UK. And as you can probably see from our current government's policies, we've got a lot of work to do. But I'm happy to share with you our latest thinking about this, and I'd be also really interested to hear your perspectives and experiences as well. First of all, I think we need to understand what sustains the current approach. And the way we've thought about it is like this. There are huge political and economic vested interests sustaining the status quo. There's a political preference for concentrating power at the elite level, and which this benefits the elite, but also wider society, as we derive a benefit from an unjust economic system. There's also systemic resistance, government systems that are geared for the continuation of existing policies and postures. So there's a huge momentum behind the existing approach, huge financial investments in pieces of equipment that span over decades. And there's a preference also in all politics for quick fixes rather than long-term investment. So there's a systemic resistance problem to confront. Thirdly, there are also cultural values and public attitudes that sustain the status quo. In the UK context, but I think more broadly, there's a faith in the kind of strong man responses. We also have a post-colonial attachment to great power, status, and a political discourse that avoids the complexities and likes to reduce things to simple binaries of good and bad. And all of this is reinforced by a mainstream media which is largely under the control of political and economic vested interests. So these are all pretty powerful systems, mutually reinforcing in many respects, and make change a daunting prospect. And I think our task is to try and find the fragile points within these systems, the points at which they're vulnerable and most susceptible to change. And while I wouldn't be wildly optimistic, I think there are definitely some chinks of light. So in relation to the vested interests, there are cracks in the neoliberal experiment, and there is a growing distrust in the powers that be. Some of their policies are also so hypocritical and scandalous, such as the arms sales to Saudi Arabia, that it's possible to put them under significant pressure. In relation to systemic inertia, there is also an awareness that the status quo is costly and wasteful, and it's not working. As I said earlier, despite more and more money being spent on security, people are feeling increasingly insecure. And on cultural attitudes, I think we can take heart from the fact that public opinion is more diverse and social media is more democratic. People are interested in hearing about a better way, and young people in particular are skeptical of the power of the establishment. Many people are hungry for a new narrative. So our first task is to try and find these fragile points, as they can give us some clues about how and where we need to work to bring about change. The second task is to try and get out there and influence the public debate. Yes, we continue to need to engage in specialist policy dialogue with decision makers, but we also need to do much more than we have in the past in the UK to influence the public conversation in communities, in social movements, and in the media. And our third task is to be able to envision both the long-term future and the immediate next steps on the path. Any significant change is likely to require a transition, and our challenge is to be able to highlight the steps it's possible to take now that start to move us further along the road, and that sow the seeds of possibility of further transformation ahead. And to do that, I think we can look around ourselves for inspiration. Those of us in the UK can look elsewhere in Europe to learn from more progressive approaches to security that exist on the continent. Those who are ready to take further steps can learn from places like Costa Rica and Bhutan, which have taken more radical measures. And I think all of us can probably learn the most from those who have lived through some of the most difficult and insecure places. In Colombia, in Somalia, in the Philippines, in Northern Ireland. Those people who've taken tremendous personal risks to promote peace and human rights because they believe that it offers the best future for their society. And I want to finish with a quotation from a writer and activist called Rebecca Solnit, and her book Hope in the Dark, which you may have come across and which I would really recommend. And she says, often the real goal is to amplify the power and the reach of existing alternatives. What we dream of is already present in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Celia, for this brilliant and extremely well-articulated presentation. I'll keep speaking in Catalan now, so if you and Rob want to put on your headphones. Bé, després d'aquesta presentació extremadament ben articulada, obrim un torn que no seria només de preguntes, sinó que tenim ben bé 45 minuts i convidem, i perquè també la Celia ho ha demanat, que vol conèixer, i nosaltres aquí que en pensem d'aquesta temàtica, doncs si us voleu esplaiar una miqueta també amb aportar les vostres pròpies reflexions, doncs crec que és un moment propici perquè tinguem aquest tipus de conversa. Per tant, resumint, si voleu alguna pregunta o observació concreta, o si voleu també una reflexió sobre el que ha dit i com encaixa amb el que veiem des d'aquí, des de Catalunya.
Ahora sí. Hablaré castellano porque como hay traducción no hay ningún problema. Cuando ves la historia, ves los efectos terribles, negativos de la violencia. Sin embargo, la violencia sigue teniendo una mitificación extraordinaria, tanto por los libros como por los medios de comunicación. Ahora estamos aquí en Cataluña en un debate muy importante porque Cataluña quiere ser independiente, pero quiere tener mayoritariamente desde el poder quiere tener un ejército, con lo cual la independencia es una burla, porque claro, cuando tú tienes un ejército eres dependiente de los que fabrican las armas, de los que dan los cursos para los oficiales, de las deudas que tienes con las empresas de armamento y evidentemente te has de situar en uno de los sectores estratégicos del mundo y a nosotros nos tocaría el Pentágono seguramente, con lo cual la independencia sería una burla. Por eso un grupo estamos intentando luchar por una oportunidad histórica de que Cataluña no tenga ejército y sea un país del siglo XXI y no del siglo XIX. A mí lo que me preocupa siempre es por qué cuando hay un conflicto, yo intento ir a las raíces, cuando hay un conflicto, en vez de utilizar las armas que tenemos las personas para resolverlos, la inteligencia, el sentido común, el amor, el humor, la compasión, ponemos nuestro conflicto y su solución en las armas. Y claro, evidentemente gana el conflicto el que tiene el cañón más grande, la bomba más grande o más capacidad de matar, con lo cual nos hacemos inhumanos, ¿no? Y a mí esto es lo que me preocupa siempre, que a los pacifistas se nos acusa de que vamos con un lirio en la mano y yo creo que los que van con el lirio en la mano o con 2 lirios son los que creen que los ejércitos pueden defendernos o pueden servirnos para conseguir la justicia. Y esta es la duda que tengo. Yo llevo ya muchos años, intento que alguien me convenza de lo contrario, porque ir contra corriente pues cansa mucho y podré dedicarme a cosas que sean, pues, no sé, contar mariposas o pasear por el campo. Pero claro, cuando ves tan clara la evolución de la historia y cuando ves que si queremos sobrevivir como pueblos y como personas, la única solución es luchar por el desarme, siempre te queda esa sensación de marciano, ¿no? O sea, bueno, que yo soy un marciano o es que no sé leer bien los libros de historia, y esto es un tema que siempre te preocupa, ¿no? De todas formas, bueno, decir que no soy un absoluto pesimista, porque yo creo que cuando tú tienes clara la historia y el futuro, pues la vida está de nuestra parte. Evidentemente son los que defienden las armas los que están a favor de la muerte, por lo tanto ellos sí que pueden ser pesimistas. Yo, como defiendo la vida, no me queda más remedio que ser optimista, ¿no? Muchas gracias.
Sí? S'escolta? Sí. Bueno, jo volia preguntar i fer unes petites reflexions. La primera és, hi ha algun país, no sé si europeu o en general al món, on creguis que la seva política exterior ha estat més encertada o més enfocada als valors que tu estaves explicant prèviament? Després, per una altra banda, crec que no s'ha tractat gaire el valor de la prevenció dels conflictes, i no parleu només des d'una vessant militar, perquè, com parlàvem, jo crec que el frame de la seguretat ha variat bastant en els últims anys, i llavors sí que al segle anterior especialment hi havia una perspectiva molt més militarista, però crec que aquesta perspectiva està canviant cap a uns enfocaments més, no sé, multifactorials, i llavors que la seguretat no només està vinculada a la defensa, sinó també a moltes altres polítiques, i evidentment la política exterior és una d'elles, però també relacionada amb el concepte de human security, política alimentària, política mediambiental. Llavors, el que volia dir és que tot això s'ha d'englobar en que, per exemple, des del Regne Unit o des de la Unió Europea, quan parlem de polítiques de seguretat, no ens hem de fixar només en aquestes imatges que sortien d'armes o de tanques o de defensa purament estricta, sinó en un sentit molt més ampli, i en això sí que sóc optimista perquè crec que les coses estan variant. Després, per una altra banda, crec que la utilització de la defensa o de la força militar així més bruta, igual això aquí sona una mica provocatiu, però no crec que hagi de ser sempre un factor negatiu. Llavors, que en molts moments de conflictes, per això crec que precisament és important la prevenció, en molts moments de conflictes necessites la força, encara que sigui per aturar la violència, poder crear un context de començar les negociacions, llavors que això igual també s'ha de tenir en consideració. I després una reflexió només final, i és respecte a tenir o no tenir exèrcit, que realment és un debat que s'està tenint aquí a Catalunya, sobre el tema de la independència, que Costa Rica, per exemple, que sí que és un dels referents de països sense exèrcit que normalment es posa sobre la taula, Costa Rica també té acords sobretot amb els Estats Units, no només per la seva defensa en si mateixa, sinó també per recolzament logístic per amenaces que viu sobretot per tema del narcotràfic. Llavors, que les coses normalment no són blanques ni negres, sinó que hi ha molts matisos, el món global és molt, molt complicat, llavors jo apostaria per respostes més multifactorials i que tenen en compte moltes polítiques diferents que no només per una concreta. Moltes gràcies.
Si us sembla, de moment ho deixem aquí, perquè han sortit diversos temes. I, Celia?
Thank you very much for those points. Maybe I'll just work upwards from the end. I think I definitely agree that it's not black and white, and what we need to be thinking of is a spectrum of different options. And nation states, which is the world we live in, find themselves on different points of the spectrum. I think what I'm arguing is that the UK in particular has a very strong reliance on aggressive military responses for reasons a lot to do with its history and culture. And I think what I'm arguing for is a rebalancing of the responses. So I'm not saying that in no circumstances ever might the military have a role to play, but I think we're making a big mistake in often using it as a first resort rather than a last resort, and thereby underplaying the importance of the political dimensions of conflict and insecurity, and I imagine you would agree with that. So while I do think, and coming to your other point, I do think conflict prevention has definitely increased in its significance to foreign and security and development policy over the last 15, 20 years. My experience in the UK is that that's quite a complex picture. So I've observed a couple of things happen. One would be that conflict prevention is given priority in situations which are not necessarily of a strategic concern to the United Kingdom. So when development policy is able to be at the centre of the UK government's response, then conflict prevention becomes a significant way of thinking about that intervention. And I think that's been, there have been some good examples of that, but what has also occurred is that if the geostrategic circumstances change, the emphasis on conflict prevention and development becomes marginalized, and other objectives come to the fore. And I think that's a real problem. The other particular concern I would have about what's happening with development policy in the UK currently is that it's being increasingly instrumentalized in some contexts for counter-terrorism purposes. So the countries that are being prioritized for UK international development assistance are increasingly those ones that are deemed to pose the greatest risk to the UK from the point of view of the terrorist threat. And so the interventions in those contexts become framed around a counter-terrorism narrative and a counter-terrorism objective, rather than being about enabling the long-term development and security of people in those societies. So while I acknowledge that there have been some really positive interventions, and development assistance in the UK is a really significant part of our international engagement, there are concerns that we still need to be very attentive to. The first question you asked, I think, was about whether there are foreign policies in other countries that might be provide a bit more inspiration. At the moment, I'm doing a comparative study of national security strategies, as many as I can find from different contexts. They're mostly European, the ones that I've come across, but also there's a few other from different parts of the world. And it's a really interesting exercise in that almost all of the strategies seem to have pretty much the same threat analysis. So they all agree on the top 6 threats to those countries. But the responses are actually quite different, more different than I would have anticipated, even in the European context. And in this sense, the UK is quite an outlier, because what characterizes many of the continental European security strategies is a commitment to the European Union as the primary driving force for building peace and stability, both in the continent and globally. And the UK obviously has a different perspective on that particular issue. What I haven't seen so far is any national security strategy where I said, oh yes, I wish we could have that one for the UK. But there have been aspects of all of them that I found really instructive. So, for example, the Spanish national security strategy, I'm sure you all have a lot of insight and opinion on, but what I found really interesting about it was that it was the only one that identified underlying drivers of insecurity similar to the ones I outlined in my presentation. So it highlighted the significance of economic inequality, marginalization, climate change in a way that no other strategies did. It then failed to actually offer any kind of response to them, but at least the analysis was there. I thought some of the German strategy is really quite interesting, and particularly the spirit in which it is offered. Because of Germany's history, it offers its security strategy as a starting point for national debate and conversation in a way that is completely alien to the UK conversation. In Canada, for example, they also, as part of their national security strategy, have an institutional roundtable that is explicitly intended to bring in what they call kind of marginalized voices that wouldn't have been heard within the security establishment. And that's supposed to be a testing ground, particularly for domestic counter-terrorism policies and the effectiveness of those. So while I can't point to any of the strategies and say, oh yes, they're fantastic templates that I wish we could all adopt, I think there are elements in all of them that are really instructive and that provide clues as to what we could be doing better. And then to respond to the first gentleman's comments, I think I can only sympathize with your experience, I think, of living as somebody who rejects war and violence in a culture where violence and war is normalized. And I think it's very difficult to continue to believe in other options when they are continually marginalized. But I do think that that we need people who are willing to articulate alternatives and to say outrageous things in reasonable ways, because that's the only way that change is going to come about. So I wish you well in your attempts to stand up for a different way of doing things, and I think it requires us to think about to engage with the different structures that I was referring to earlier that sustain a kind of militarized response, and think about how we can challenge those most effectively. And also perhaps how we can recognize that it's going to take us a while to go from where we are to anything that looks radically different. And we need to be able to show the path as well as the destination that we would like to reach.
Moltes gràcies. Moltes gràcies per la teva intervenció. Ha sigut un gust i un plaer sentir-lo. Formo part també amb el Pepe i alguns altres que estem d'aquí d'un seminari que anomenem Estat de Pau, que seria una cosa similar a la que tu participes, d'estudiar possibilitats alternatives. Ens trobem aquí amb el fet que es plantegi la possibilitat de la independència amb una oportunitat que ha mobilitzat molta gent de molts diferents àmbits en l'oportunitat de crear una cosa nova. I, evidentment, una d'elles és també tot el tema de la seguretat. En aquest sentit, es presta a promoure debats sobre aquests temes i, de fet, els tenim oberts en diferents àmbits i se'n va parlant cada vegada més. Jo crec que, a més, tenim una certa tradició que juga a favor nostre aquí a Catalunya, una certa tradició en l'objecció de consciència, en l'oposició a la guerra, les mobilitzacions més grans que es van donar al món, per exemple, contra la guerra d'Iraq, però podríem remuntar-nos a molts altres fets històrics. Hi ha una certa sensibilitat social que mai sabem al final de tot el que pot desembocar, però hi ha una certa sensibilitat que ens fa possible entrar en aquest debat amb menys hipoteques que en altres llocs. Sempre és més fàcil imaginar crear un estat nou sense exèrcit que haver de desmuntar un exèrcit ja muntat. I això estratègicament, diguem, ens situa en una posició més favorable. M'ha resultat sorprenent el grau de coincidència entre les reflexions que ens has fet tu, probablement molt més elaborades, les nostres són més incipients, però en termes generals anem a parar exactament al mateix lloc. És a dir, hi ha l'argumentació ètica que sembla mentida, diguem que encara com a éssers humans continuem consentint que la resolució dels conflictes es faci a garrotades, ocasionant tants sofriments, tanta destrucció, de manera que més que una solució és el problema, moltes vegades el mateix sistema de seguretat. I després tenim tot el munt d'argumentacions estratègiques, que també tu has desgranat sobradament, que generem, que és dir, que això no ens dona seguretat, aquest sistema. En podríem parlar molt, però m'agradaria fer un apunt amb un tema concret, arran també d'algunes coses que s'han dit abans per aquí. La utilització de la força en casos, ni que sigui per aturar la violència. Aquest és el tema, jo crec, Filipí, que sempre se'ns diu, és a dir, sí, bueno, i què, i com evitarem la violència. A mi aquí m'agradaria fer una reflexió que ens hem fet nosaltres, que és que ens sembla que seria aplicable o que hauríem de pensar que fos aplicable en les relacions internacionals el mateix que els estats fan o ens exigeixen de portes endins. De portes endins amb totes les imperfeccions, però és un camí, diguem, que ha anat progressant. Els ciutadans renunciem a l'ús de la violència per als conflictes privats i, en canvi, tenim una policia, un sistema judicial, un sistema de resolució de conflictes intern que té, a més, fins i tot quan s'ha d'utilitzar la força la policia, l'obligació d'intervenir ocasionant el mínim danys possibles. I quan la policia ocasiona danys, s'obren investigacions, se'ls aparta del cos, etc. I constantment hi ha una pressió popular exigint que la policia aturi els delictes, els riscos, sense ocasionar danys col·laterals, diguem-ho així. En canvi, l'opció militar, i em penso que això és una cosa que hem de defensar, està basada exactament en el contrari, en tenir la màxima capacitat de fer mal com a element dissuasiu i resoldre els conflictes fent el màxim de mal perquè els altres es retirin del conflicte. I això és absolutament immoral i absolutament intolerable. I em sembla que això també és el que hauríem de vendre de portes enfora. Allò que ens exigim en les nostres relacions també s'ha d'exigir en les relacions internacionals. De portes endins funcionem amb un sistema de seguretat compartida, no de seguretat privada. Internacionalment continuem funcionant amb la seguretat privada i cadascú s'espavila a tenir l'exèrcit tan poderós com pot i amb el màxim poder de destrucció.
Thanks. I just wanted to pick up on the study you're doing on national security strategies, which sounds really interesting. When the UK brought out its national security strategy, it had encompassed development into UK national security, and that is now part of the narrative in the UK. And I just wondered how far any of the others, as far as you've seen, have done that. And our response was that UK national security should be a subset of international peace and security, not the other way around. And we were reassured as activists in the UK that international security, conflict prevention, development was very, very high on the agenda. But because it's the UK national security strategy, the number one objective is about UK security, UK nationals. And I just wondered if any of the others have links to the international level, because one of the pillars of the UK national security strategy is the UK's position at the heart of a rules-based international system. So basically the rule of law at home and abroad is something that I think you were referring to in part there. We have ways and we have laws and things that work to a certain extent. And yet when you look at the international behaviour of a large number of Western states, as exemplified in the example you gave around Saudi Arabia and Yemen, they drive a tank through the rules-based international system when it suits them for strategic purposes. And I just wondered if, in your comparison of national security strategies, that element comes in at all. And if I may, just one other little aspect. Given that the UK also includes development in a large part of its national security discourse, and that funding has followed suit through different funding mechanisms that actually put ODA spend into a slightly dodgy neighbourhood, shall we say. I wondered if any others, if you've had a chance to look at how their aid spending reflects the national security strategies. Thanks.
So to respond to your point first, I think it's a really well-made argument that actually we need to be replicating what works for us in managing conflict within societies more generally. And I think the rule of law is a really important guiding principle. As Rob started to point out, the UK in its national security strategy speaks briefly about the primacy of the rule of law, but there's a huge gap between the rhetoric and then the reality of upholding it in practice. But I think that gap creates an opportunity for engagement and debate, because we can try to hold the government to account for the obligations that it has at an international level and the obligations that it's not living up to. And that's why the current scandal over arms exports to Saudi Arabia is a really important opportunity for us in the UK context to be making some of these arguments. In relation to the question about the role of development in other nations' security strategies. So they do vary quite considerably, and this move, I think, to having national security strategies is quite a recent one, and you can see there's quite a lot of copying and pasting from one country's strategy to another. I don't necessarily think it's altogether a good thing that that security is becoming the lens and the framework through which development and peace and so forth are considered. My analysis so far is that there's wide variation in the strategies. So some of them talk largely in traditional defense terms about what kinds of defense capabilities, military capabilities they're going to be deploying. Others talk far more than the UK does about the primacy of international cooperation and alliance building as the key means by which they will build security globally. So quite a lot of the continental European strategies have a very strong focus on the United Nations and on the European Union as the mechanisms through which to address global peace and security. And I would say they give it a lot more importance than the UK one. I haven't seen development integrated to quite the extent of the UK one in other strategies that I've looked at so far, and I think we probably agree it's a move that we should be really cautious about in the UK context and try to resist. And I think what I was also trying to articulate in my presentation is that if we got other aspects of policy right, whether that's development, justice, inclusion and equality, our security strategies would possibly need far less attention than they're currently given. The primacy of security as a response to the state of the world is a reflection, I think, of our inability to address some of these problems effectively through other means.
Morning, buenos días. Soy abogado, máster en Relaciones Internacionales, y quería plantear una cuestión a la ponente, que nos ha ilustrado también, sobre la famosa ecuación que se hacía a nivel internacional por costumbre de dar a entender que con las sociedades, los estados, los países dotados con un ejército fuerte, eso equivalía, suponía, a una mayor seguridad, a una mayor defensa. Eso parece que ha quedado ya felizmente desterrado, ¿no? Desterrado, superado. Entonces, ahora entiendo yo que no procede tanto ahora la violencia por parte de quien tiene el control de las armas, de los ejércitos, sino que se ha desatado, especialmente en su país, con virulencia, un fenómeno que todos nos tiene sorprendidos y nos tiene un poco así desconcertados también. ¿Cuál es el terrorismo integrista? Utilizando además ya no las armas convencionales, sino ya todo tipo de utensilios de lo más peregrinos. ¿Cuál es entonces un poquito la respuesta internacional que se le puede dar a ese nuevo fenómeno parte de países civilizados?
Buenos días y gracias, Celia, por su intervención. Ha sido muy interesante. Pero yo quería realmente habló mucho sobre Irlanda. Irlanda el proceso de paz es muy importante, pero no es comparativo realmente ni siquiera con Colombia, ni siquiera con cualquier país del tercer mundo. El trabajo en los países del tercer mundo creo que sabe más que nadie. Hay un factor geoestratégico de intervención en los conflictos, que si no tenéis la misma libertad de trabajar en estos países, cuando hay una intervención directa e indirecta en estos conflictos, ¿cómo se puede trabajar en esto? Realmente eso es lo que a mí me llamó la atención sobre el tema, porque Irlanda es un proceso de base muy importante, pero no hay esta intervención que hablamos del juego geoestratégico para mí, como paisano del tercer mundo. Gracias.
There were a few issues understanding your question, but I think the gist of it was what should be the response to the emergence of the kinds of terrorism that we're currently seeing, particularly in Western countries? Yeah? Or in general? Okay. So that's a really big and difficult question. And so my response to that is that it needs to be broken down and looked at in its complexity. I think the response to what's happened recently in the UK, for example, with the attacks, needs to be very different to and tuned to the UK context in a way that will not be relevant to addressing the threats from ISIS on the ground in communities in Syria and Iraq, for example. I find it easier to talk about what might be appropriate responses in the UK context because I'm much more familiar with it. But I might say tentatively offer a couple of thoughts in relation to the Middle East as well. So I think the starting point that would be relevant to both is to appreciate the complexity of factors that encourage people to turn towards this kinds of violence. I recently watched sorry, this might sound like an anecdote, but I recently watched a program on Al Jazeera about the export of foreign fighters to Syria from Trinidad in the Caribbean. Trinidad has the largest per capita number of ISIS fighters going to the Middle East of any country in the world, which is an astonishing statistic. And what this program did, which is so absent from our discourse in the UK, was go around and interview all kinds of people in that society to try and understand why these young men were going to fight. And it did an excellent job of identifying the full range of reasons. And they ranged from poverty, social marginalization, being part of a gang culture, the role of Islamic ideology, the allure of a different life overseas. It looked at the whole range of factors, and it didn't try to simplify into one or two particularly important drivers. And I think that's really, really important to bear in mind, is the complexity of reasons why individuals get involved. And in the UK context, I think our primary response should be trying to understand that complexity a lot better. The limitation of the current response is it's focusing primarily on trying to stamp out extremism, so destroy extremist ideology without actually looking at a whole range of other factors that contribute as well. So I think we need a much more fine-grained analysis of what it is that is driving people to make these decisions before we can reach for any kind of appropriate strategic responses. But I think that the responses will need to include a range of measures that address issues such as discrimination, exclusion, systematic poverty, and a whole range of factors that are at play in the UK context, as well as the role of ideology in encouraging people to get involved in these horrific acts. I think in terms of the Middle East, I'm not personally an expert on the conflicts in Iraq and Syria, and I think the starting point should be a deep understanding of those places. But I do think Western response strategies for engaging with international terrorism need to be about meeting the long-term needs of the communities in those societies and engaging with a commitment to building peace and justice over the long term, rather than simply eradicating terrorism as a threat to the West, which is currently what's driving responses. So that's a very incomplete answer to your question, but it's a plea for at least an understanding and appreciation of complexity and a commitment to the long term, and seeing this as an issue about addressing long-term drivers and causes. In response to the other question, I completely agree that Northern Ireland is very different from Colombia, which is very different from Sudan, and very different from the Philippines. So I fully acknowledge that what worked in Northern Ireland is not the recipe for anywhere else in the world. That goes without saying. I don't think you can transport the lessons from one peace process and the model to another, but I do think that there are commonalities that need addressed in a lot of conflict situations. And I know from my experience that people who are involved in conflicts in different parts of the world learn a lot from hearing about how similar challenges have been addressed in their own, in other societies. There's a lot of people at the moment from Northern Ireland going to Colombia to share lessons from the peace process there. And the responses that will be needed in Colombia are Colombian responses. But that's not to say that you can't get inspiration and ideas from what has been tried elsewhere. And I think sometimes it's even just through the recognition of the fact that something won't work in a particular context that you start to realize what the opportunities may be for doing something differently. I don't know if you want to add anything there, Christian.
No, not really. my work is actually to do comparative learning, but there is one thing that we have learned very clearly. All peace processes ask the same questions and try to learn from others. But the recipes have to be homegrown. And that means that eventually each peace process, while they learn from others, end up innovating when trying to apply them to their own contexts. And I think that's what's fascinating. There's probably right now, the army and the FARC in Colombia are probably about the most expert analysts on peace processes in the world, because they have looked at all of them in detail. And when applying those lessons to their own context, Colombia is now a reference for other contexts who try to learn what can you do differently from what we've been doing. All peace processes learn from others and at the same time contribute to others. En David, em sembla?
Una pregunta, Celia. Gràcies per la teva intervenció, interessantíssima i brillant. Hi ha un aspecte que has dit que penso que l'hauríem de treballar més quan has parlat de la seguretat com un dret comú. Perquè, per exemple, has parlat del tema d'Aràbia Saudita, la venda d'armes per part del Regne Unit. L'estat espanyol també és un dels temes clàssics. Hi ha una campanya contra l'arms aquí a Espanya que intenta també això, que hi hagi un qüestionament de la venda d'aquestes armes. I ens trobem amb la dificultat de fins i tot davant de sindicats, partits d'esquerra que han sortit en els darrers anys, de fer entendre que vendre aquestes armes té unes conseqüències molt negatives i que, per tant, això no és només un dret de treball. I penso que la perspectiva del dret comú és interessant perquè quan suposa aquestes vendes d'armes amb el dret a treball aquí, òbviament s'ha de dir que aquest dret de treball va contra un dret de treball i fins i tot contra un dret a la vida en els altres països que puguin ser afectats. I que, per tant, aquesta visió de trencar aquest compartiment estanc del dret aquí realment és important, perquè si no sembla que no hi ha cap altra alternativa des de l'extrema dreta fins a l'extrema esquerra que vendre armes quan te les demanen, perquè això crea llocs de treball. I per tant aquí, en tot cas també penso que en general a Europa hi ha bastants qüestionaments de les vendes d'armes, en el cas d'Aràbia Saudita en concret, que s'ha agafat una mica com a icona, i penso que sí que és un moment en el qual molts governs estan veient-se qüestionats per aquest aspecte i que hi ha una certa unitat d'acció, encara no estigui treballada ni definida, però de moltes ONGs i moviments arreu d'Europa per intentar entendre que si realment es concep que cal defensar els drets humans i la pau, vendre armes a règims que fan tot el contrari és una incoherència absoluta. I penso que aquí hi ha, com deies, una certa esquerda que s'està aprofitant i que val la pena veure com els governs s'han de defensar davant d'aquesta situació.
Bon dia, good morning. En primer lloc, disculpo perquè faig una pregunta que probablement tenia més sentit fa estona. Tota la teva intervenció, que ha estat molt interessant, i amb algunes de les preguntes que s'han fet durant la jornada d'avui, m'ha semblat percebre una certa ambivalència al voltant del terme de seguretat. La seguretat com a percepció, la seguretat com a objecte, la seguretat vinculada a aspectes securitistes, militaristes o de defensa, o la seguretat com a dret. Partint de que en la conferència parlaves d'una altra seguretat, potser abans de proposar mecanismes per garantir la seguretat, caldria definir si la seguretat en si mateix és un bé comú o no. Hi ha diferents visions acadèmiques al voltant de si el que cal és treballar al voltant del concepte de seguretat o treballar al voltant del concepte de la cura. Sigui com sigui, el concepte de seguretat, si més no aquí, a Catalunya, a l'estat espanyol i crec que arreu d'Europa, és percebut com una necessitat positiva per a les persones, però en canvi els aspectes que es vinculen o que vinculem o que algunes persones han alimentat perquè vinculem el concepte de seguretat no sempre generen seguretat. Fa una estona, amb una de les teves respostes, crec recordar que parlaves que algunes de les estratègies, de les prioritats per construir la pau al Regne Unit estaven massa vinculades a la seguretat. I en aquesta resposta m'ha semblat percebre que la vinculació a seguretat era negativa i per això aquesta reflexió al voltant del concepte. Potser caldria aclarir molt més i posar-nos d'acord amb si és un valor positiu a preservar i després caldria vincular-lo a propostes concretes. Moltes gràcies.
I si us sembla, amb aquesta pregunta acabem aquest torn. Algú altre que volgués dir alguna cosa? Va, doncs...
Thank you very much for that question. I think what we're calling for more than anything is a debate about what security is and what it means and whether it's a positive value or not. We started to engage with the concept of security after years of talking about promoting peace and finding it was very hard to make any progress. And we realized that it was the narrative about security, which was the dominant narrative, which was defining the terms of engagement in relation to conflict and violence. And so our decision was to engage with this narrative about security as a way of thinking about how it interacts with opportunities for peace and development in the world. So if my answer wasn't clear before, I'm sorry, but I think what we were trying to articulate is security as currently framed. The narrative that dominates current discussions is a narrative that's not helpful. But what we need to be doing is turning that narrative around and trying to articulate security in a way that links to the meeting of people's basic human needs and their ability to live free from fear. And if we can change the nature of the narrative about security, we might make some more progress towards towards building longer-term peace and opportunities for development. So that's the kind of that's the way we're trying to look at this issue. In my own experience of talking quite a lot about security for the last couple of years, in town halls and workshops with young people, I've found that the question, what makes you feel secure, is a really interesting question to start the discussion with. And people respond to that question in a way that is completely different from our dominant narrative about what security means and how it is built. If we refer back to our own individual lives and think about what makes us feel secure or insecure, we have some really useful starting points for a bigger conversation about what security is and how it might be developed. Going to the question now about arms exports to Saudi and the importance of international law. I can just refer briefly to the UK campaign on this, which is being run by Campaign Against Arms Trade, and their efforts over the years to try and engage with the different arguments being used to support the existing system. And one of the most powerful arguments that supports our arms exports is the jobs that it provides for communities in the UK. And so some of the work that they've been doing has been about articulating how what the alternatives are to the arms industry jobs. And they've actually identified the potential for the skill sets used in those kinds of jobs to be transferable to the green energy field for renewables. So they have a big campaign called Arms to Renewables, which is intended to demonstrate how it might be possible to convert this part of the jobs market into into an industry that is actually providing for our common future in a much more sustainable way. But there's a long way to go on that argument, and in the UK context, we don't have trade unions particularly as an ally in that conversation. So there's a lot of work still to be done in persuading trade unions that there is a viable alternative to the arms industry for their particular membership and constituencies. Thank you.
Thank you, Celia. Gràcies a totes i tots. Crec que ha estat una sessió molt participativa. Gràcies, per tant, per totes les vostres intervencions. Tinc la sensació que, no sé si és casualitat o no, però aquests dies estem molts immersos en un hiperactivisme d'activitats i debats i conferències sobre temàtiques semblants i temàtiques com aquesta, la d'avui, que per cert no són noves, és a dir, són recurrents. Tindrem ara em sembla que és la 33a sessió de la Universitat Internacional de la Pau a Sant Cugat, per tant fa més de 30 anys, i ja des dels seus orígens es plantejaven debats com els que estem tenint avui aquí mateix, actualitzats amb l'evolució de les formes de violència que estem vivint o patint en el món en el dia d'avui. Tindrem les sessions de la Taula Catalana per la Pau i els Drets Humans a Colòmbia, on precisament el tema del futur de les forces de seguretat i del concepte de seguretat és més rellevant que mai, perquè no ha estat part de l'agenda de la negociació, com sí que ho ha estat en altres contextos, la reforma del sector de la seguretat, i sí que comença a haver-hi un consens ampli, no només a la societat, sinó també dins de les forces de seguretat, de que el futur de què s'entén per seguretat i com es respon a les amenaces de seguretat a Colòmbia ha de ser un debat obert i, per tant, que és incipient, però que de la mateixa manera que amb un debat sobre una possible independència a Catalunya ens permet fer com un reset, crec que el cas de Colòmbia, com l'acord de pau principal que hi ha hagut en el món els últims 10 anys, també permet en aquell país un cert reset per dir, i d'aquí en endavant, com ens plantegem aquesta temàtica. I el que em sembla fascinant és que aquest debat l'estem tenint en paral·lel en molts països al mateix lloc, al mateix temps, i que per tant sessions com la d'avui, on hem pogut sentir a la Celia i el debat que estan tenint al Regne Unit, que puguem tenir més intercanvis com aquests i per tant aprendre i nodrir-nos mútuament sobre com anem evolucionant en l'anàlisi i en les respostes, doncs crec que és una línia que mereix aprofundiment. Gràcies, per tant, a FundiPau per haver organitzat aquesta sessió d'aquest matí i tenim una petita pausa fins a la propera sessió amb en Rob d'aquí 12 minuts. Gràcies.